Could you talk about where we are right now in this conflict? Because I think many people are looking at this and saying, wow, the escalation ladder is being climbed and it's climbing quite quickly.
Well, it is. I mean, it's a very dangerous. I personally believe that the world hasn't faced a crisis, a nuclear crisis of this scope and scale since the Cold War, or even never. I'll give you an example. 1962, October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. First of all, the missile crisis was slow rolling. It didn't happen instantaneously. Indeed, the big event we were worried about is that Soviet ships were heading to Cuba. There was a naval blockade put in place, and then we were watching the ships coming in to see what would happen when the two hit. And while that was happening, though, the leaders of both countries were making phone calls. They were talking to each other. Imagine that diplomacy. There was a Russian ambassador, Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C., who was not only meeting with the government officially, but working a back channel to the Kennedy White House. And there were similar lines of communication being opened up with Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. There was dialogue taking place. And as a result, they were able to manage this crisis and avoid a decisive confrontation, avoid a war. And a lot of people say that's the closest we came to a nuclear conflict. Well, today we have a situation where there is no slow-moving convoy heading to each other. We basically have given the Ukrainians permission to fire long-range, precision-guided American-made munitions into Russia, ostensibly to strike places in Russia that are being used to attack Ukraine. There's a couple flaws in this thinking on the part of the West. First is the notion of we can't let Russia have a safe haven. You see, if Russia is going to launch attacks from inside Russian territory against Ukraine, then Ukraine must have the ability to strike back into Russia. I say, well, if that's the case, then what about the safe haven that Ukraine has today in Europe, in NATO? You know, the one where they have airplanes, they have pilots being trained on F-16s in Belgium and elsewhere. In any war situation, those would be legitimate targets and should be struck. What about the tank repair facilities that exist in Poland, in Germany, in the Baltic nations? If you take a piece of combat equipment off the battlefield and are repairing it to send it back to the battlefield, that becomes a legitimate target of war, the repair facility. What about the warehouses where weapons that are being sent to Ukraine are being stored in advance? Those are legitimate targets. The lines of communication, the free flow of material and manpower. You know, it's basically the NATO version of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, going back to Vietnam. That North Vietnam ran out of North Vietnam, then down Laos and into Cambodia along the western border of South Vietnam, where they would just move their logistics. And the United States was frustrated because they're saying, we can't fight them in South Vietnam and all this material is coming in. So we began to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We began to launch commando attacks. We invaded Cambodia to run a war to prevent this safe haven from happening. We know what it means to have a safe haven, and we know what it means, but what we have to do in response. We know what we did. And yet we're telling the Russians, oh, you can't attack NATO because of Article 5. Oh, attack against one, attack against all. So we are creating this safe haven. We know that it's by employing this safe haven the way we do, that we are becoming parties to the conflicts, but we won't admit that. And then we have the hypocrisy of telling the Russians, but you can't have a safe haven. Russia has reminded everybody over and over again that this isn't a war. This is a special military operation. If you want to make it a war, then that's something totally different. But this is a special military operation. Now, Ukraine is firing these missiles. What makes these missiles being fired from Ukrainian soil particularly sensitive to the Russians? We go back to the Soviet Union times when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And then you had a Warsaw Pact of Eastern Bloc nations. Western missiles were actually pushed way, way, way to the west, and they were deployed in West Germany and the Netherlands and Italy and the United Kingdom. But it took a while when those missiles launched to get to Russia. Gives Russia some time to assess, is this a real launch? What's really going on? Was it a mistake? Do we need to immediately retaliate? There was a buffer built in there, sort of reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Time to consider actions. One of the great dangers of the later stage of the Cold War in the 1980s is when we deployed the Pershing II missile into West Germany, because the Pershing II was a solid rocket missile with very fast flying. And suddenly, instead of having 20 to 30 minutes to talk things over, you had 5 to 7 minutes when that thing was launched before it hit the Kremlin, which means there's no time to talk. That's why I always tell people, when you meet a former weapons inspector who implemented the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, buy them a beer, shake their hand, and thank them for keeping you alive. Because by implementing the INF Treaty, we saved the world. There would have been a nuclear war. There's no doubt in my mind there would have been a nuclear war, one that killed everybody, because these weapons were so destabilizing. But we got rid of them, and that was a good thing. The Russians, when they built their command and control for their nuclear warfighting capability, their early warning radars, some of their advanced missile locations, did so under the assumption that you had this buffer, Eastern European buffer, the Belarus and Ukraine, and then you come into Russia proper, Central Russia. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, those Eastern nations went away. They now become part of NATO. NATO moves up, and Russians are going, hey, you're getting a little close. We don't like this. Don't get so close. But we kept coming. And now we want to take Ukraine away. And if you take Ukraine away, it's like a giant ice cream scoop, just scooping out the center of Russia's land buffer. And now, if that becomes NATO and NATO puts missiles in there, you literally have missiles that are going to enable Ukraine, as part of NATO, to launch a first strike against Russian command and control, nuclear command and control, early warning radars, missile launch facilities, national command. And the Russians went, that will never happen. You're never going to be allowed to do this, ever. That's why William Burns in 2008 wrote that memorandum. Niet means niet, no means no. And he said, the Russians mean this. If we being the United States, seek to bring Ukraine into NATO, William Burns wrote in early 2008, there will be a civil war in Ukraine. What do you think the Maidan coup was? What do you think the Donbass? It's a civil war where ethnic Russians rose up against Ukrainian nationalists, a civil war, a conflict that will lead to Russian military intervention that will result in Ukraine at a minimum losing Crimea and the Donbass. Well, what did Ukraine lose? Crimea, the Donbass, and Kherson and Zaporizhia. This was a predictable outcome. We knew exactly what would happen, but we did it anyways, because a lot of people believe that the Russians are bluffing, that the Russians are weak, that the Russians won't follow through. Ray McGovern, who I believe is also a friend of your show, former CIA analyst, a very, very smart man, talked about how in December of 2021, when the Russians put in their draft treaties to resolve this conflict peacefully, one of their big concerns was American missiles or NATO missiles ending up in Ukraine, threatening Moscow and these command centers. And indeed, there was a period of time where the Russian negotiators and American negotiators met in, I believe it was Geneva, Switzerland, where they talked about this. And at first, the Americans promised, I think Joe Biden promised Vladimir Putin, we'll never put missiles in Ukraine. We'll never. We have no intention of doing that whatsoever. And Putin's like, good, that makes things very easy, because if we can get this guaranteed in a treaty form, we maybe can ease up on some of our other conditions. Our big concern are the missiles. And Biden's like, don't worry about it. But then when the negotiators met with the Russians, suddenly they weren't talking about missiles. The Russian goes, hey, we want to nail down this missile thing. And they're going, no, that's too restrictive on NATO. We can't do that. We can't impose. We want to have that there's no missiles, but we can't impose that up front because that makes us look like we're yielding to your demands. And of course, we can't be seen as yielding to the demands of Russia, no matter how reasonable they are. And the Russians the whole time are going, wait a minute, Biden said no missiles. You're saying you can't. So the Russians knew from day one that the Americans were going to be bringing in these missiles into Ukraine, and they used them to attack. And so what Russia has done is say as forcefully as possible that this is an unacceptable expansion of the conflict, one that represents a existential threat to the survival of the Russian state. It's non-nuclear, but nonetheless, missiles fired that take out nuclear command and control, take out early warning radars, etc., becomes an existential. And don't believe Scott Ritter. All those people are, Scott Ritter doesn't know what he's talking about. He's an idiot. Well, maybe, but maybe not. We'll find out. But, talk to the United States, read America's nuclear doctrine, where we speak about cyber attacks. And one of the interesting things about the verbiage we use to describe cyber attacks and the consequences, we say that if there's a cyber attack that threatens to shut down national command and control communications, the ability of the president to communicate with his nuclear command people, with his early warning systems, with the weapon systems themselves. If there's a cyber attack that does this, then the United States is allowed to assume that it's the precursor of a larger attack, and then we can preemptively strike any threat that we've deemed. So you hit us with a cyber attack that threatens our nuclear infrastructure, and we're allowed to assume that it's an attack on our nuclear infrastructure designed to take it out. And so we will preempt that by using our nuclear infrastructure to take out the source of the cyber attack. Well, gosh, if we can do that for a cyber attack, aren't the Russians allowed to do that when actual missiles strike? When ATACMS missiles or HIMARS missiles are used to strike these targets in Russia that represent part of their new, and it's not theoretical, ladies and gentlemen, at least two Russian early warning radar sites that have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine and everything to do with Russia's ability to detect new missile launches that could have a nuclear dimension to them. So we've already allowed Ukraine to attack Russia's nuclear infrastructure. We've allowed Ukraine to launch an attack against Ingalls Air Base, where they destroyed some strategic bombers. Again, one of the key aspects of Russia's nuclear doctrine is if you attack our nuclear infrastructure, including the weapon systems used to deliver nuclear weapons, even if you attack them in a non-nuclear manner, we will be allowed to respond as if we were being struck with nuclear weapons. So Ukraine has attacked Russia's nuclear bomber fields in Ingalls. They've attacked at least two nuclear-related early warning systems, and now they have missiles that can attack command and control and actual nuclear capable missile sites. What is Russia supposed to do? Nothing. Stand back and do nothing. And so I have been saying that we are one ATACMS missile attack away from a nuclear conflict, that all it takes is the Ukrainians to fire one missile that hits the wrong target on the wrong day with the wrong people in it, and we're going nuclear. And that's just a statement of fact. Now, what has Vladimir Putin done? Now, in the lead up to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the Russians were saying things, not necessarily Putin, but Dmitry Medvedev, who sort of is the bad cop to Putin's good cop, and others, including very influential political and military commentators on Russian media, were saying that, Russia, if the West does this, if the Germans use they provide with the Taurus missiles, or if the French give them Scout missiles that are targeted, or if the Germans give them Storm Shadows that are targeted. Because understand, when I say targeted, Ukraine can't target any of these systems. Everybody, let the Ukrainians fight. Okay. But if you let the Ukrainians fight, they can't use these weapon systems. Why? Because they all are GPS-driven systems. Now, you say, well, Scott, Ukrainians have a GPS downlink capability. That shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, but what makes these weapons work isn't just the GPS, it's that they can be updated with very precise intelligence information that can only be gathered by the United States and NATO using their satellite reconnaissance capabilities, using aircraft that loiter in the vicinity, using other capabilities. They gather this information, and then they're able to build a strike package, not just about the target, but what's protecting the target, where the radar envelopes are, where terrain combines with a gap in coverage to create the potential for a drone to navigate its way through without being detected. And remember, because the Russians, like any professional military, are constantly moving their air defense, even as you prepare the attack, the satellites are looking for changes, and then their updates are being sent again. Now, these updates are being sent along very sensitive communications channels capable of transmitting top secret, what they call special compartmented information, SCI material. When you have TSSCI, it's automatically no foreign. That means no foreigner. Ukraine can't touch it. So the Ukrainians can't, they're not sitting there at a satellite downlink waiting for the printout to come out of the American targeting data. The Ukrainians are in another room. The Americans bring in the targeting data. Now, we have to load it into the various weapon systems. That's a technical capability that Ukrainians simply don't have. They're not trained to do. So we take the intelligence that we collected based upon a target that we selected, and then we give it to American hands who puts the guidance information into the weapon system. And then and only then does the Ukrainian hand come out and push the button. It's an attack by America against Russia. That's literally what's happening here. And the Russians have said that this could lead to nuclear war. But Vladimir Putin, again, I know in America we don't like to talk about this, but hey, guys, thank him, because he's the only adult in the room. He's the man who said, I'm not going to continue climbing the escalation ladder. I'm looking for a way off. I'm going to add, at a minimum, add more rungs so that the climb is a little bit longer. We buy a little bit more time. We're not rushing to nuclear conflict. So he said, look, we understand what you guys are getting ready to do, and we understand who's responsible. But rather than us directly attacking you, who can play at this game? You want to attack us using your weapons through a proxy, Ukraine. We will find third parties around the world who will serve as our proxies, and we will give them long-range precision-guided weaponry that's capable of striking the United States and Europe, or both, if the conflict expands to their territory. So if the United States, for instance, sought to bomb Libya again, maybe this time the Libyans have been equipped with long-range missiles that can be fired and take out sites inside Ukraine, and maybe part of the inside Europe. I'm sorry, and maybe part of the deal that Russia is going to cut with these nations is a mutual security pact, so that these nations, if Russia is attacked or something happens, are going to be obligated to respond, and they will use these long-range precision-guided munitions to take out sites inside the United Kingdom, inside Europe, that otherwise would be incapable of being attacked. And so, what he did is he created this possibility. Then immediately everybody in the West panicked. My God, the Russians are doing this. Have they done it already? Where would these missiles go? And then Putin came out at the plenary session and said, we haven't done it yet. It's something we're considering. But, maybe if the West picks up the phone and calls me and tells me that they're not going to attack us or they're going to back down, maybe we won't do it. You see what he did there? He bought time. He created additional rungs up the escalation ladder. He has, tried to de-escalate this rush towards war. He's the only adult in the room, as I said earlier, and it's his policies that have given me vague hope that we can somehow navigate out of these troubled waters and into smooth sailing ahead. But it isn't because the Biden administration is avoiding conflict or Emmanuel Macron in France is avoiding. It's because Vladimir Putin is avoiding conflict, and Vladimir Putin's doing everything in his power to limit the potential of direct conflict. How long he can do this, only heaven knows. We do know that the West continues to view any effort by Russia to avoid confrontation as being a sign of weakness, that somehow Russia, you know, is intimidated, they back down, etc. That's not the case. Russia's a very strong nation. Russia just doesn't want to commit suicide. They don't want a nuclear conflict. If you look at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, the final plenary session, Vladimir Putin didn't start off by talking about the dangers in the world that exist. He talked about BRICS, about economic issues, Russia's growing economy, Russia's trade with other neighbors, and how Russia will use BRICS to cement a coalition of nations that will provide the rest of the world an alternative to the G7 group of 7 nations headed by the United States that seek to impose their will on them. This is very much the year of Russia, but the year of Russia scares the hell out of the West, and so for the moment, the West is leaning aggressively forward, trying to intimidate Russia, to somehow convince the Russian people to rise up against Vladimir Putin, to convince Vladimir Putin that there's no chance that Russia can prevail. None of that resonates in Russia. Anybody who's been following Russia understands the importance of what happened in March when Putin won re-election. Overwhelming turnout, overwhelming percentage of those who turned out voting in favor. This is a mandate. And then listen to what he said on May 7th in his inauguration, and you see that Putin's taking Russia down a completely new path, one that has everything to restoring Russia to its to the status it should enjoy, given the size and strength of the nation. But this scares the United States. It's the last thing we want from Russia at this point in time.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.